Good morning. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tony Payan. I'm the director of the Center for the U.S. and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. Thank you for getting up this early today and being here. Let me just welcome you to this conversation on Mexico's the path forward. Mexico, as you know, just inaugurated a new administration on October 1st, 2024, to be specific. The challenges for the new administration are daunting. The president, Claudia Sheinbaum, inherits a country truly in dire straits. And unfortunately, she has not yet exhibited the due independence to turn policy around. Still early on, but we haven't seen yet any signs. On the country, on most things, in fact, she seems to have doubled down. Let me be clear. I'm not optimistic about the country's current landscape as much as I would like to be. We all want a better Mexico, and we all want a better North America. But what that appears to be receding into the horizon, as far as I can tell. This doesn't mean that we will not continue to work on our vision, a more inclusive, democratic, and prosperous Mexico, sitting on a very competitive North American platform. Thus, in some ways, our work just got more challenging. As a Center for the U.S. and Mexico, we will take on this challenge and keep our eyes on the prize, however far it may seem right now. In many ways, our work has just got really a lot more challenging, but also much more important. My diagnostic is clear. Mexico today is less democratic. It has dismantled the representative plural democracy that it was building. The dialogue, said the new president, is with the people, not with the opposition, and certainly not with the other political parties, which got nonetheless a 46% of the vote on June 2nd. Mexico is today more repressive as opposition figures, journalists, and critics have found themselves under siege by the new political elite. Mexico is today less accountable and transparent as Congress prepares to dismantle all regulatory agencies largely responsible for accountability and technical expertise of the economy. Mexico is today less just as it has politicized its judicial system with a dubious reform that is not likely to pay off. Mexico today is more violent as the previous administration allowed criminal gangs to operate freely throughout the country, and the current administration has already declared that it will not lift a finger to fight organized crime. Mexico is today more corrupt as one form of nepotism and privileged access to public contracts has simply shifted from one political class to another. Mexico is today less productive as it has disinvested in its education and healthcare systems. Mexico is today less integrated as the infrastructure deteriorates more quickly despite huge investment in a handful of infrastructure projects, none of which I expect to pay off anytime soon, or not at all. Mexico is today less competitive as it sets out to set back the clock on its energy landscape and ramps up to aggressively recarbonize its productive capacity. Mexico is today more indebted with no economic expansion and a growing number of domestic and international liabilities that will overburden the budget for decades to come, even as international investment is tepid. Mexico is today weaker in its place in the international diplomacy, and certainly the relationship with Washington is on the rocks. So, more than ever before, we will continue to call on some of the foremost experts on Mexico to come here to the Baker Institute to enlighten us on what is going on, what we can expect in the coming years, and what we as think tanks can do to get the country back on the right track, from our own perspective, of course. So for this conversation, let me introduce our guests. From the right, it's Congressman Tony Gonzalez, who represents the 23rd District of Texas, a huge district between San Antonio and El Paso. And then we got David Gance, our non-resident fellow on international trade and economics, the Will Clayton Fellow here at the Baker Institute. And then we have Liliana Alvarado, who leads a think tank in Mexico City, Ethos. Welcome, Liliana. It's a pleasure to have you here. And then we have Javier Martin Reyes, a professor of law at the major university in Mexico City. So without any further ado, I'm going to ask them, beginning with Congressman Gonzalez, to give us their perspective on Mexico's state today and what we can do to ensure that Mexico corrects some of these policies that I think are definitely on the wrong path. After that, about 5, 6, 7 minutes each, then we'll engage in conversation. I will ask some questions, and then you can engage our panel in conversation. Congressman, your turn.
Yeah, good morning. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you to the Baker Institute for inviting me. Man, you set quite the tone there with with some of the issues that we're dealing with, and I would echo a lot of those sentiments. One of the issues that comes to mind is security. Not only our security in the United States, but our security in Mexico. Americans deserve to be safe. Mexicans deserve to be safe, and I worry about that. I think back to some times in history where there's been a lot of violence and power struggle that is occurring, and I'm seeing many of the same things happen. And it's not just in one part of Mexico; it's kind of throughout. Well, I have people visit me all the time, and they'll say, oh, Tony, we're doing business in Mexico, and I'll ask them, okay, what part of Mexico? Because they act as if Mexico is this small little country. Okay, what part of Mexico? It's like saying I do business in the United States. Well, do you do East Coast, West Coast, the Southern, North? All that makes sense. A lot of times they will struggle to even determine the geographic of Mexico. So it's not. Some of the violence that's occurring, it's not just happening where it's always occurred, it's happening in other places. And I'll give you an example. I'll bring it back to my district, which is 823 miles of the southern border, which is 42% of the U.S. Mexico border in general. Over the past several weeks, our schools in Presidio, which is a small West Texas town, have been closed. Why have they been closed? Because there's been violence and unrest on the Ojinaga side of the border. That's real. And these issues are only growing. The other concern I have from a security standpoint is you have more and more people that are coming to the United States through Mexico that we have no idea where they're coming from. And thinking back to my military background, having spent 20 years in the military, seeing how the unrest across the world is. You see what's happening in Ukraine and Russia. You see what's happening in Israel and Lebanon and Gaza. You see what's happening in the Pacific with China and aggressive towards Philippines and Taiwan and some of its neighbors. These threats are very real. And so one of the things that I worry about is, what if there was a terrorist action that occurred in the United States that the person that initiated that terrorist action passed through Mexico? Well, guess what? The gloves would be off. It would be Mexico. You're already hearing some of the rhetoric. Let's go in there and let's neutralize some of these cartels. That all sounds fine and dandy, but when you start unraveling the onion, that gets very complicated very quickly. And what I don't want to see happen is our neighbors to our south be our enemy. And I feel as if for too long, politics, is very easy to blame the Mexicanos for everything that's wrong. I mean, it's so easy. You throw rocks at them. You're the reason why fentanyl is killing our kids. You're the reason why we have all these folks that are coming here illegally. And then it's very easy for the Mexicanos to blame the gringos. Oh, you're the reason why. Same thing. And we go back and forth. Makes for good politics. It's all fun and dandy until something serious occurs, and then now all of a sudden you have people in the United States demanding action. I mean, I think back to 9/11, how one day no one knew where Afghanistan was. 20 years later, everyone knew where Afghanistan was. I don't want that to happen. I don't want to be the person that says, I told you so. I don't want to be the person that points at the problem. I want to be the person that helps get ahead of the problem and solve it. That's from a security standpoint. That is very much on my mind. And we have to work together. The United States and Mexico have to work hand in hand in order to get ahead of that problem set. On the economic piece to it, there's huge opportunities with the reshoring and nearshoring that we saw through COVID. There's huge opportunities. What I like to say is there's huge opportunities for North America, not just the United States, but for North America. But we have to partner together in order to do that. A lot of these projects don't just happen. They require investment, long-term investment in infrastructure, in cooperation. You talk about, water. I mean, some very basic kind of things that you can fight over very easily and go nowhere. So essentially, there's a great opportunity for the United States and Mexico to grow this partnership stronger than ever before. There's a huge opportunity as well for us to be even further behind than we are now. And I think the next several years is going to determine that. We have a little thing going on here called an election in the next several weeks that is really going to determine the path forward in how the United States and Mexico deals with one another. I look at it through the lens of the House. To me, the White House will be determined, the Senate will be determined, but the House, in my eyes, the House of Representatives is the closest to the people. It is built in our Constitution that we are the power of the purse, and we are the ones that should be having a stronger, more direct dialogue with other countries like Mexico and have these discussions on, I have no problems with foreign aid, I have no problems with cooperation and doing these things together. But if there is no partnership, then guess what? There will be no checks. I mean, you cannot be giving resources to people that are undermining what you're trying to accomplish. And this is an area that I think there's great opportunity to sit down and have a dialogue, but it also has to be a frank dialogue. I'll close with this. I really appreciate you kind of setting the tone. And, oftentimes in politics, you'll sit down, you'll have dinners with these ambassadors or these other elected officials, and it's nothing but pleasantries. Oh, you're so wonderful, the art is wonderful, everything's so wonderful. You're doing a great job. No, you're doing a great job. You're right, we're both doing such an amazing job. I like pleasantries too, but I also like getting to the root of an issue so you can actually solve an issue. Even if it's in pedacitos, even if it's small incremental steps, but you have to have a frank conversation in order to do that. One, you have to show up. There has to be someone willing to sit down with you. And two, you have to be, sensitive in how you discuss things, but it cannot just be dialogue. It cannot just be, that we're doing wonderful jobs. And it also cannot be blame. It cannot just be, look at all the terrible things that you're doing. I would say the United States, we're partners on this. One of the sayings is, when the United States gets a cold, when the United States sneezes, Mexico gets a cold. I'd say when Mexico sneezes, the United States gets a cold. I mean, we're juntamos. We're together on this. Whatever happens to one happens to the other. There are great opportunities for success, and there's great opportunities for failure. And the next several years is going to determine this. And I believe it's the House of Representatives that will lead that way.
Thank you. David.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Congressman. That's very perceptive comments. We're supposed to be talking about perils and opportunities. As I think Tony set the stage, it's a lot easier to talk about the perils than it is about the opportunities, but hopefully I can address both of them in the next few minutes. I think as someone who has been following Mexican issues pretty carefully for the last 35 years, the apparent reversion to a one-party dominated system, at least until the midterms 3 years from now, and maybe much longer, really limits new President Sheinbaum's flexibility to deal effectively with all of the challenges that we've been talking about. And frankly, I saw Morena's appointment of AMLO's son, López Beltrán, as the organizational secretary of the Morena party suggests to me, number one, that AMLO is going to have a very heavy hand in Sheinbaum's administration, and number two, the stage may be being set for another López, in this case, López Beltrán, presidency. I want to point out that it's not just an issue of there being a one-party state with a lack of an independent judiciary. A lot of it is the chaos that people are worried about beginning in mid-2025, when Mexico, in theory, is going to elect half of its new federal judges, and some of the states are probably going to do the same thing. I mean, Western investors are used to dealing with one-party system. Think about Vietnam. It's dominated by the Communist Party, has been for more than 50 years. It still runs the country. But more or less, they have managed to establish a level of predictability, not certainty, but certainly predictability. So investors have learned to live with the system. They have people they can talk to. And Vietnam has not created a lot of surprises, unlike China these days. We could talk more about that if we have time later on. But I think a lot of foreign investors are waiting, and many others, the rest of us, are waiting to see what's going to happen, whether the election in, just 7 months is going to be chaos, or whether it will work out reasonably well, and then you begin to see the changes. For somebody who's been a lawyer or a law professor for a very long time and has had probably several hundred Mexican students in our graduate programs, I'm aware that finding experienced judges, particularly if they're associated with one party, may be very difficult in a country where you have, several thousand law schools, some of which very small, and a situation where there's no bar exam and no character and fitness requirement for someone to become a licenciado and be a lawyer. So I worry about that, and obviously I wonder about how many of these judges in the chaos are really going to be the puppets of the drug cartels. And I think we really have to worry. I mean, I think it's very, very much in the U.S. interest to have a vibrant, strong Mexico with good growth, employment increasing, and to do that, Mexico has to have direct foreign investment, and if that slows down over the next 6 months or a year, as seems risky, it's very bad for the U.S. as well as for Mexico. Obviously, the president has to address some of the energy shortages, the brownouts, and she's dealing with this at a time when the CFE electricity monopoly is apparently getting stronger and will remain very strong from the constitutional perspective. Obviously, there are other problems. I won't talk about security. That's already been very well addressed. The drug traffic, infrastructure issues, growing budget deficits, which among other things means that PEMEC and CFE will have even less money to work with. And obviously, Dr. Sheinbaum has endorsed the AMLO reforms, but at this point, she is stuck with them. One of the issues that's going to come up sooner than we think is this USMCA mandatory review of the agreement in mid-2026, which may continue annually for a long time unless the parties agree to extend the agreement. And at this point, both Trump and Harris have promised to spend a lot of time and effort on that review, and probably, among other things, they're going to make it more difficult for Mexico to sell cars, Canada as well, in the United States. And that's another source of uncertainty for foreign investment, particularly in the enormous auto sector, and that worries as well. Mr. Trump has promised, global tariff increases of 10 to 20%, 100% on automobile imports to Mexico. Who knows how much, if any of that will go forward, but it's something that is out there and I think should be of concern to the Mexican authorities. And it's worth keeping in mind that notwithstanding this review, any party to NAFTA can withdraw from it with 6 months' notice. So there's no guarantee that things will continue along the way in which they've been going now. And you have other problems that Dr. Sheinbaum has to deal with, President Sheinbaum has to deal with, genetically modified corn, expropriations, all sorts of problems with the new constitutional provisions, which are inconsistent, sometimes as written, sometimes as applied, with the U.S. MCA. And you're dealing at a time, Mexico is dealing at a time, that despite the efforts of some, like Congressman Gonzalez, is a U.S. government that's becoming extremely protectionist, buy American, invest American, employ hopefully union employees, rather than continue the balance that we have had with Canada and Mexico over the last 30 plus years, a balance which I think has made all three countries far stronger than they would be otherwise. I think that one of the things that I would like to point out is that for companies that are worried about investing in Mexico, there's also the possibility of reshoring, and of course the leading place for that would be Texas, including but not limited to the El Paso area and San Antonio. Texas is a very friendly climate for foreign investment. The taxes are very low. The infrastructure is very good. So I think it's it's useful for Mexican authorities to keep in mind that that is out there. Even with higher wages, it is an opportunity. Okay, in a couple of minutes, let me just say, what are the opportunities? There's a way, I think, to address incrementally the power issues by allowing, again, independent power production. So if Tesla eventually sets up an auto factory in Nuevo Leon, they can have some power company, either Tesla's or somebody else's, to provide the power directly to them, and then they don't have to fuss with dealing with CFE at all. I think that would be very useful. It doesn't solve the problem, but it would help. Of course, the investors have to be relatively sure that once they put billions into this plant, it's not going to be taken over by the government. I think one of the silver linings for Sheinbaum is the election in 3 years. If by some chance, and we can hope, or I can hope at least, that Morena loses its supermajorities, it gives Sheinbaum at least a basis for saying to Morena and AMLO, look, I can't do all of these things anymore because I can't deal with the Congress. I have to compromise. That, I think, would be an improvement. She can also keep in mind, I think, that the U.S.-China trade war, unfortunately, in my view, in some respects, is not going anywhere. It's going to be around for decades. And there will be certain companies that, regardless of all the problems we're talking about, will still invest in Mexico. Not as many as we'd like, but certainly many of them. And the other thing, and then I will finish up, Mexico is still receiving, because of the very hardworking Mexicans living in the U.S., both legal and otherwise, about $60 billion worth of financial transfers. Most of these, other than for education, are just subsistence for the families back at home, but that's still bigger than tourism. It's bigger than petroleum. It's bigger than the net gains from the automobile industry. So that's something that's out there that you can probably reasonably well depend, unless you have significant proof that much of that money is going to the drug industry. So with that, I will quit and be delighted to talk about some of these issues if there are questions.
Thank you. Liliana.
Thank you so much, Tony, and also the Baker Institute for Public Policy for the invitation. I'm more than honored to be here with you to share some ideas on certain issues that have been inherited by the Obrador administration and whose management by President Claudia Sheinbaum is quite uncertain, I would say, and therefore worthy of concern. So as all of you know by now, President Sheinbaum has only been in office for the past 15 days. But I have to say that there are certain problems that have been worsening for the past years and that could reach their lowest point during this administration. And to me, one of these issues is crucial because it is definitely the backbone of many others. And I'm referring to Mexico's public finances. So I also have to say that there is concern regarding the government's capacity to comply with its spending commitments, given the low level of tax revenue that we have in Mexico. This is not only when we compare Mexico to other OECD countries, but also when we compare Mexico's tax revenue to Latin American countries. So to put this in perspective, let me tell you that the average tax revenue for OECD countries is 34% of GDP. And so Mexico's indicator is 17% of GDP. But then we also have countries in Latin America like Brazil Brazil's indicator is 33% of GDP. Argentina's is 29% of GDP. Even Bolivia's tax revenue is at 23% of GDP. And lastly, the average tax revenue for the Latin American region is 22% of GDP. So I have to say that this level of revenue is insufficient when we basically consider like three main elements. So the first one would be still the resources that will need to be allocated to some of the infrastructure projects that were started with the Obrador administration. Of course, we will have many more details on this on November 15 once the budget is presented. But for now, I can tell you that we still need more resources, at least for 2025, for the interoceanic train that is being constructed in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, and also for the Maya train. And for the Maya train, because as many of you may know, this train is was initially conceived as a passenger train, but now President Sheinbaum has said that she wants to expand this project and also make it a cargo train. And there's also other trains, for example, the Mexico City Toluca train that hasn't been finished. This train started with the Peña Nieto administration and many others. So we also have other types of commitments that arose with the President Sheinbaum's, the campaign commitments, right? So here I will not go or touch upon all her commitments, but let me just talk about like the ones that will represent a huge burden to our public finances. And so the first one would be this cash transfer that would be around 3,000 pesos, which would be around, let's say, 160 USD. This cash transfer will be given to adult women ages 60 to 64. However, the president has said that for year 2025, this transfer will only be given to indigenous women and Afro-Mexican women ages 60 to 64 and just adult Mexican women ages 63 and 64. And this is a cash transfer that is given every 2 months. But then we also have this program, which is a universal scholarship, and the president has said that she will give it to students from preschool, elementary, and also middle school. She has also emphasized on the fact that for 2025, she will only give it to middle school students. This is also a cash transfer of around 1,900 pesos. If you have an additional student at home, you can get 700 pesos more. During her campaign, she also mentioned that she would have her own infrastructure projects, of course, but she just described very generally that she wanted to expand some ports, that she wanted to build new roads and also modernize certain rural roads. She mentioned that she wanted to increase the salary also for military personnel, for police officers, for teachers, and for also personnel in the health sector. But then on October the 1st, at this huge Zócalo meeting that she had, she committed to many other things. So let me just mention that she said she was going to do all these well-being pharmacies, and she was going to build more than 1 million homes, and that she was going to build also universities all over the country, and she was going to allocate budget for a care system. I mean, she said that we were even going to launch a satellite, right? So she was not shy in committed to different things. And so the third element of concern, I would say, is related to how Pemex, our oil company, has been handled. As you may know, Pemex has been supported, or it was supported for the last administration, and this support has been very, very controversial. The oil company has been supported through capital injection, but also through a reduction of its tax burden. So this has been made, or the objective in theory was to like alleviate or improve the oil companies' finance, but we obviously know that the finances of Pemex are doing like worse, and that actually Pemex is the oil company that has the highest debt in all of the world, right? So we still don't know if President Sheinbaum is still going to support Pemex as López Obrador did. I have the perception that she will, but once again, I have to say that this represents a high burden for our finances. So all of these three elements that I just mentioned quite briefly obviously imply a need to maintain a high spending, which I also have to say is quite contradictory with the idea of reducing our public deficit from 5.9% to 3.5%. And then when President Sheinbaum was asked, so how do you plan on financing like all of this? She has given an answer that to me, it really hasn't I'm not more like at ease, once I heard her answer, because she said, okay, so through two ways. One would be digitalization and more technology, both in customs and also in the tax administration service, or the SAT, how we call it in Spanish, the SAT, right? So I have to say that during the Peña Nieto administration, there were many improvements regarding technology in the tax administration. We had, for example, the implementation of a tax mailbox that actually did facilitate the communication between taxpayers and also the authority. We had also this transition from paper invoices to electronic invoicing. We also had many other measures that made it easier or more simple to report your tax return. But I also have to say that if you want to include or implement more technology into the SAT, you actually need to invest, right? And obviously, that investment, you have to wait till you get results. I mean, it's not like you get immediate results in terms of additional tax revenue. And so regarding customs, I have to say that there are certain problems in customs that need to be addressed before you can even think of customs as a revenue source. And these problems are related with corruption networks and also organized crime. So without going any deeper into this topic, I do have to say that many experts do believe that sooner than later, the Sheinbaum administration will have to implement a tax reform. I have to say that she has said that she doesn't really need this tax reform, and that she will be fine with this digitalization and introduction of technology. But I also do believe that the tax reform will come probably for year 2026, the latest. But I think that we also need to wait and see how things turn out.
Thank you, Liliana. Javier.
Well, thank you very much, Tony, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I guess I'm going to talk about the legal and constitutional perspective of the issue. And let me just start with something that happened this Saturday in the Senate. I guess for an external observer, it's really hard to understand why 3 days ago in the Mexican Senate, we had a lottery, literally a lottery, like a bingo, to determine which judicial positions at the federal level are going to be elected in 2025 and which ones are going to be elected in 2027, right? We recently had a major constitutional reform that basically fires all sitting federal judges in Mexico. That includes, of course, the Supreme Court, that includes also district courts, and that includes also the intermediate appellate courts. So that's a major transformation of our judicial system. In many ways, I think it's a terrible reform. Just imagine if in the U.S. President Biden or President Trump proposes something like that, to fire all federal judges and then to implement a system in which by popular vote we're going to select every single sitting federal judge. That's happening right now in Mexico. And I guess it's important to understand how did we end up at this point. And of course, part of the explanation is the kind of president that López Obrador was. I guess at this point, it's relatively fair to say that López Obrador was a left-wing populist president. He was not a president that believed in liberal democracy. He didn't think that his government was just another administration of the Mexican democracy. Since the beginning, he said that his government was going to imply a regime change. That's why he always talks about this fourth transformation, right? Throughout Mexican history, we have three major changes. First, the independence, then the reform, and then the revolution. And for López Obrador, his government implied a change as relevant at this, like these three transformations. But there was a huge paradox, at least during the first years of the López Obrador administration. And this paradox is that he believed that he was changing the regime, but he didn't propose a new constitution. And in fact, if you see the first 3 years of the López Obrador administration, it's pretty clear that there were some constitutional amendments, there were some constitutional reforms, but those were relatively limited. And also you have to remember or understand that the Mexican Constitution is, by some standards, the constitution that is reformed more frequently in the whole world, right? We have the 6th largest constitution. It's a constitution that it's changing a lot. And during the 3 years, the first 3 years of the López Obrador administration, yes, there were some reforms, but they were not major fundamental reforms. What happened is that López Obrador thought that he could govern and transform the country through administrative decisions. And what happened is that sooner than later, he met the checks and balances of the system. So there were a lot of decisions that the Mexican Supreme Court and the Mexican judiciary took. I would say they were absolutely not activist decisions. They were decisions that were basically applying what the Constitution and the law said. But López Obrador was really not happy with those kind of decisions. First, during the midterm elections in 2021, he wanted basically to make a referendum in terms of saying like we need a supermajority in the Chamber of Deputies, in our House of Representatives, so he could implement now major constitutional reforms. That didn't happen. López Obrador, Morena won those elections, but they didn't get the supermajority in the Chamber of Deputies. And he said that he wanted, during his second the second half of his period, that he wanted 3 major reforms: an election reform, a National Guard reform, and an electricity reform. All those initiatives failed because he didn't get the votes in Congress. And for the 2024 election, although he was not on the ballot and although he couldn't be reelected, he decided to create what has been called the Plan C. And the Plan C was basically to get the supermajority in both chambers, in the Senate and in the House of Representatives. And President López Obrador, in February of this year, presented 20 initiatives. 18 of them were major constitutional reforms. One of those initiatives was the judicial reform. A second one was a National Guard reform. A third one was an initiative to disappear basically all autonomous institutions. In Mexico, we have regulatory independent agencies that are recognized at the constitutional level. President López Obrador basically wants to get rid, all of them. He's respecting the central bank, but in general terms, he wants to disappear them. And there was also an election reform. What happened during the elections is that López Obrador, not López Obrador, but Morena and his party, not only win the presidency with more than 60% of the votes, but they also basically won supermajorities in both chambers of our Congress. I think there was a lot of expectation regarding what would Claudia Sheinbaum do with these reforms. And unfortunately, I would say that the new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, has completely embraced this legislative agenda. So during September, a kind of weird period in which we have a new Congress that was elected during the last elections, and during that month in which López Obrador was president, during his lame duck period, the new Congress decided to approve two of these reforms. The first one is the judicial reform. Many people thought that maybe there would be some changes during the legislative process. To be honest, it didn't really happen. So we will have this new system in which basically all judges, both at the federal and at the local level, are going to be elected by popular vote. But it's also a system that's going to control a lot who can get nominated to compete for those positions. It's not like any, lawyer in Mexico could say like, oh, I want to run for office, and then he or she is going to have this opportunity. No. In order to be on the ballot, you have to be proposed either by the president, by the Senate, by the House of Representatives, or the Supreme Court. And at this point, it's pretty clear that both the executive and legislative branches are controlled by Morena and his allies. So basically, everyone who is going to be on the ballot will have to be approved by, Morena, or at least some sectors of Morena, right? The other reform that is pretty worrisome is the National Guard reform. In Mexico, the National Guard is something very different compared to what you have in the U.S. The National Guard is basically a federal police. And what López Obrador and later Claudia Sheinbaum supported was the complete militarization of this institution. And also, there was a change to a constitutional clause that limited the intervention of military authorities during times of peace. That clause was modified. Now, military authorities will be able to do whatever secondary law says it is possible. And I would say that the third reform that's going to get approved probably during the following few weeks is precisely the disappearance of these autonomous institutions. To be honest, I see more perils than opportunities, at least from the constitutional perspective. I would say that we don't really know where Mexico is going to end in 3, 6, or 9 years. But what can I tell at this point is that it is true that López Obrador, Sheinbaum, and Morena are constructing a new regime. It's going to be a regime that is less democratic. It's going to be a regime that is less controlled. It's going to be more autocratic. on that sense, and it's also going to be a regime that it's more militarized, with weakened, civilian institutions and the military taking over different tasks that they should.
Thank you. Let me get back to Congressman Gonzalez. Here's a couple of questions. I guess the overall question, Congressman, is, will Washington ever ask itself, when did we lose Mexico? And is that do you see on Capitol Hill any ability to pay attention to what is going on in Mexico? We've discussed the role that Ken Salazar has played. He seems to have been co-opted by the López Obrador administration. The Biden administration is occupied with a lot of other things. Capitol Hill, obviously, the dynamics better than we do. Not quite paying attention to what is, to me, the most consequential country in the lives of so many millions of Americans. You know that as a border congressman. At what point are we going to say, when did we lose Mexico?
Sadly, many of my colleagues don't understand Mexico, nor do they care to understand Mexico. What they do think is, and I'm talking many of my colleagues, they do think Mexico is a failed narco state. That is dangerous. That is extremely dangerous, because now you're putting Mexico in a category that you put some of these other very extreme countries in. And this is the part that regardless the route that Mexico is on, they can't pat themselves on the back fast enough on what a wonderful job that they're doing, not realizing that this relationship is getting worse and worse off. And there are fewer and fewer members that genuinely want to solve this, get ahead of it. Politics and academia have a lot in common. We we love to discuss the problem set. We can talk about the problem set to the end of time. Politics is a little bit better about blaming whose fault it is, right? It's never my fault. It's always somebody else's fault. But I'm very interested in solving the problem. How do we get back on track? How do we redirect things before it gets to a point that is a point of no return? And once again, we start going down some of these routes, which we're already headed, but there has to be a partner. You cannot, I think back to a time when I've been all over the world twice over. I visited Israel, and I go to Jerusalem, I go to all these places, and then I went to the West Bank, and I went and visited with the leader of the Palestinian Leadership Authority, and for 1 hour, I could not get one word in. It was a one-way conversation of all the different things that were happening, right? All the things that had happened to his people. Totally get that. But if there's never a dialogue, you can never move past that and get towards solution. And I'll give you a more real example. I was scheduled to go to Mexico City to be at Claudia's inauguration. I was scheduled to do that. And guess what? I decided not to go. ¿Por qué? Why? Well, I have so many things going on. Why would I spend my time to go out there? I was trying to kind of hat in hand, basically show, hey, I want to be a partner as we move forward with whatever. Mexico is a sovereign nation, whatever they decide to do. But once again, this relationship that we have, but there is no one on the other end of that door. And if I'm thinking that way, when I actively want to, and I actively am encouraging to try to find solution, the bulk of my colleagues have no interest in even doing any of that. So we're getting down this very dangerous route. Why is it important? I think back to it, the power of the purse. I sit on the Appropriations Committee. You want to get somebody's attention? You take away their money. You watch how fast they squirm. Or you give them money, and you watch how fast we work together. I remember having dinner with one of these diplomats, and the whole conversation was how wonderful a job Mexico is doing on the border, right? You may be able to get away with that on a senator from West Virginia, but you can't get away having a conversation with the member of Congress that represents half the border, because I have 100 different receipts on why these issues were. And so I listened to him for a half hour of how wonderful job Mexico was doing. I go, you know what? You've convinced me. You've convinced me that Mexico is doing a wonderful job on border security. So this year, you don't need any foreign dollars from the House Appropriations Committee. That is a little extreme, but I think there needs to be a dialogue where this can go one of two ways. And the last thing I'll say is the USMCA, as we renew this, guess where that's going to start? that is going to start in the House. And guess how many people understand that problem set? Not very many. And so the people that are at that table, and I've worked very hard to be at that table, to have a dialogue, to try to engage and come up with a solution, will be where we start. If there is no one on the other end, this will not go well for Mexico, certainly won't go well for the United States. So we're just on this path that I think already is very rocky unless we make some changes.
You know, as you were saying that, I was thinking that Mexico's civil society is under siege. Journalists, academics, critics, anybody that stands up and says something against the government today is subject to retaliation. And the president, former President López Obrador, I'm not sure where Sheinbaum stands on this, has made it very clear that he was displeased with the U.S. supporting civil society through USAID and such efforts to continue to get organized, to continue to get the message, the critical message. I think it's really important that the U.S. Congress, in my view, support those efforts and support civil society and support successful local governments. The opposition governs most of the state capitals, and it governs quite a few of the urban centers. There is an opposition there, but it is increasingly muted and increasingly under siege. And I think that part of our work as think tanks, as members of Congress, is to support those grassroots efforts to see if we can get democracy to flourish again, to prosper again in this rather hostile soil. And so I think it's really important that I think that message sip into Congress.
I mean, to your point, I spent a lot of time on the Mexican problem set, and I have visited with mayors, visited with governors at all like the local, state, and federal level, and I'm seeing the Morena party, very similar to previous parties, just try to get a stranglehold on all facets of government. And I remember visiting with one individual in particular. I'm like, ¿por qué es Morena? Like, you're exact opposite of Morena. Like, all of a sudden, now you're part of the Morena party. And he's like, look, man, I basically see which way the wind is blowing, and I want to be on the right side of the wind. And I totally get it. And so, but it's, I wouldn't say it's dangerous. That's internal politics. You think American politics is complicated, try Mexican politics, right? It gets very complicated very quickly. I'm not looking to engage in domestic politics. What I am looking to do is to say the United States and Mexico should have a partnership. And when we don't have that partnership, it is dangerous to everybody involved, and we all lose. There are no winners in this. This route that we're going is a lose-lose route. Because once again, I'll reiterate, so many of my colleagues don't understand Mexico, nor do they care to understand Mexico. And it's very easy to say, Mexico is a failed narco state, let's go after these criminal organizations. You know what that means? That means let's go after the Mexican government. I mean, it gets complicated very fast. So it's just a dangerous route that we are already on. You add in whatever happens in November and this thing escalates even further. You add in a terrorist action occurring or something major of that, it just escalates even further. We have to get a point to go, how do we get back to legal immigration, conversation on legal immigration? How do we get a discussion on technology and reshoring and these positive things, military cooperation, just these aspects of it? We are well away from that route right now.
David, the USMCA, as you mentioned, is up for review and revision in 2026. The winds are not on our back. In fact, I think we got strong winds on our face. Increasingly protectionist sentiments in the United States, a Mexico that's drifting further and further away from a well-regulated market economy and democracy. What can we expect in 2026? How can we get back to the table, and if we're going to open the agreement, get a better agreement? Or is the agreement doomed to kind of fade into the sunset? What do you see there?
Well, I don't think it's going to fade into the sunset just because there's a lot of private sector benefit on all three countries. But I think major changes are going to be demanded. I would not say requested. I would say demanded by the U.S., whether it's the Harris government or a Trump government, because both of them have made it very clear in the campaign that they want to see certain aspects opened up, and the major one on both sides is the automobile sector in North America. Trump, of course, has proposed 100% tariffs, sometimes 200% tariffs, on all cars coming from Mexico to the U.S. I think it's very unlikely that will happen, but it's just a way of starting the discussions. Harris has criticized the USMCA, and she was one of only 10 senators that voted against it, presumably for environmental reasons, because it gave too much to Mexico in terms of auto and auto parts production. So I think you're going to have a big fuss over automobile rules of origin, and I think whatever the U.S. demands, and if anybody wants to know, I can talk a little bit more about what the Trump administration wanted, 5 years ago. If anybody, the demands are going to be changes that make it easier for companies to make autos in the U.S. and harder for them to transfer or even continue the business in Mexico. Immigration will be around. Expropriation will be around, and we're talking about I'm talking about the U.S. Objectives. What else is there? I don't know. If you talk about autos and immigration, hopefully about drugs, whether you can do anything about them, another question. I don't know what else there's going to be room for, and as you and some others already know, I am pessimistic that the three governments are going to agree on most of these things in 2026, which means it gets kicked down the road for another year and year and year. 2026, I would point out, is congressional elections in the U.S. 2027 is congressional elections in Mexico. 2028 is another presidential election. So there's no time when you can do this without it being politically sensitive. And part of the problem is even Mr. Congressman Gonzalez colleagues who don't pay much attention to Mexico overall pay a lot of attention to the auto industry, for example, and to immigration. So I think it's going to be a very political process, and I would not even begin to predict what's going to happen, except once it gets done, when it gets done, it will not be for the benefit of Mexico.
David, another question that has to do with China. China is obviously interested in Mexico. The USMCA was part of that attractiveness of investing in Mexico, but the U.S. Is increasingly worried about Chinese activities, not just around Taiwan, as it happened this week, but in Latin America, in Africa, and elsewhere. There is an emerging rivalry. The Secretary of the Economy in Mexico, Mr. Marcelo Ebrard, has said that if Mexico was forced to choose, it would choose the United States over China. But that's one person in a very diverse government in Mexico with a lot of anti-American instincts. So I think that in Mexico being nationalistic, certainly in Morena, it means being anti-American. What role do you see as China expands operations in Mexico, in the automotive industry, in other supply chains, and will Washington eventually squirm at the possibility of a very strong presence of China in Mexico, driving towards the expansion and ratification and expansion of trade? David?
I see there's several aspects to this problem. The focus in the last year or so has been concerns about Chinese companies building factories in Mexico and exporting electric vehicles to the United States, so-called connected vehicles with very sophisticated computer system, where the U.S. government feels, I think with good reason, that these can be used for spying on military bases, on power plants, and things of that sort. So the U.S., I think, is going to prevent that from happening. Regardless of the idea of tariffs, the regulations, which will be, I think, formalized probably next month, are going to make it illegal for anybody to export to the U.S. Software and hardware for connected vehicles, and obviously mostly embedded in the vehicles, whether it comes from China or Russia. Russia I don't think is an issue. And whether it comes from Mexico, it comes from Brazil, it comes from the EU, and obviously from China. So the U.S. will keep the vehicles out, and I can't imagine that Mr. Trump, if elected, would want to change that policy. He would probably make it harder. one of my concerns with the uncertainty for Western investors, particularly U.S. investors in Mexico over the next, say, 6 months or a year, is that there will be Chinese efforts to fill that vacuum. The Chinese, needless to say, businesses, whether they're partly government or not, are quite used to dealing with a one-party system. They're quite used to dealing with a lack of any sort of strong legal system. The Communist Party appoints all of the judges in Mexico. There are no elections. There's nothing else. If you're a member of the Communist Party and a lawyer, you can sometimes be appointed. So the Chinese are, and they're also used to dealing with a government that, particularly in the last 10, 15 years, that changes its policies day to day and week to week. So in a sense, they're very well placed to invest in Mexico. But at the moment, if you're going to build an auto factory in Mexico, you have a limited number of cars you can sell in Mexico. Maybe you can export to 50 countries which have foreign free trade agreements with Mexico. But on the whole, it's a problem. I worry more about other types of investment. Some of you remember that during the Peña Nieto regime, there was talk about Chinese investment in a cross-isthmus freight route, which I think makes a certain amount of sense for Mexico. If China supports that kind of activity, if China starts supporting port modernization, this is an area that has caused a lot of concern in the U.S. in many other places, including Africa. I think the level of friction between the U.S. and Mexico over Chinese investment is going to be worse in the future than it is today, and I don't think it will be entirely focused on the auto sector as it seems to be at the moment. But the pressure to move out of China is still there. So whether you have nearshoring in Mexico or reshoring in Texas and Arizona, other states, I think there will be an economic conflict, and it's going to be very harder for Dr. Sheinbaum than it was for AMLO to say to the Chinese, no, go away, or no, we're not going to subsidize it. And I think this is going to be a major source of friction if Western foreign investment gets worse than it already is.
Liliana, I have a question for you. You got a 5.7% budget deficit this year. It's probably going to grow next year. You got a number of liabilities that the government has, not just servicing a higher debt. It's been going up. But a number of cash transfer programs that lead to very little to no productivity. And you have an economy that has stalled with less than 1% growth. No expansion, no additional tax base. Foreign investment, certainly greenfield foreign investment, that's kind of tepid. At what point the Mexican Treasury will hit the brick wall and then have to reverse? She's already announced a 10% budget cut for next year, 2025. How much money can it be thrown up in the air or burned through before the country begins to say, we're heading down an unsustainable fiscal path, and change has to happen?
Yeah, I definitely think that you're right, Tony. Let's also mention that, for example, the economy's growth for this year has been reduced over the year. Now, for example, the World Bank has estimated that the economic growth for this year might be 1.7%. For example, Bank of America has estimated 0.8% growth for the economy in 2025, which is very low. And I mean, this is definitely the scenario that you've pointed out, that the President Sheinbaum has compromised, and she has like so many commitments that she feels that she has to do. Like I said, some of them are inherited from the López Obrador administration. Others, she has committed herself. And to me, everything she promised in the Zócalo was just like overwhelming. Like, why did she do that, right? It would be very hard for her to stop all the social programs, because as we know, a lot of the popularity from Morena comes from the social programs. So this will definitely not be done. So there are many aspects that worry. And I also think that, for example, President Sheinbaum is also betting on certain aspects which I don't see will really work for her. For example, nearshoring, right? We've talked about nearshoring already. But I do find it quite difficult for this nearshoring or reassuring to really work and like make the economy grow, because I do think that the way that the violence is escalating has to, you know, like prevent certain investors or like foreign investors from coming, or even national investors from investing. I do think that there is a problem in terms of connectivity. We've already said in terms of the access to water, to electricity, to gas. So how quickly can you really, you know, like establish all the conditions in order for nearshoring to really work? Also, this has also been mentioned by the World Bank, like that the conditions have not been, are not there at the moment. So how long will it take? And also, like, what is the government doing now in order to make these conditions work? The only thing that I have actually that I know that the government has done in terms of like promoting nearshoring is some tax expenditures. There is a immediate deduction of fixed asset that the government approved for nearshoring. There's also like a 25% deduction that the government approves for training expenses for employees. But the truth is that this tax expenditure budget was presented last June, and we can see that the revenue loss for these tax incentives was very low. So what does this tell you? That really the investors are not taking advantage of these tax incentives, or that they just believe that they are not being attractive enough, right? So I am also like more on the pessimistic side. I think that November 15 is a crucial day, because the budget, you know, like many like credit agencies, and then the eyes will be put on how this budget is, the details on the budget, and also this budget needs to be credible, right? So there is this thing here that the government needs to make this budget credible. So let's see if they do.
So the national debt in Mexico is still fairly reasonable, 56% of GDP.
Yes.
In the United States, we got 110% or 120%. Japan has 250%. Italy has 200 and some percent. So many folks would argue, well, Mexico still got some runway. They could potentially go to international markets. The very first act of the Sheinbaum administration was to place $18 billion in the markets, financial markets in New York. So is she simply going to use that runway and indebt the country, get the country indebted to meet all these obligations and subsidies and cash programs, and continue to subsidize Pemex, and with a stalled economy?
She could. I mean, that would definitely not be something healthy for our finances, but she definitely could, you know, like she has the Congress on her side. So if this is something that she wants to do, and she will like privilege like the high spending, and she will definitely
probably at least through 27, right? To win the elections, the midterm elections of 27, and then face the face the hangover after 27.
Yes, or like I said, the other option would be to actually think about a fiscal reform. You know, like many think tanks and also ethos, we've been like working on different proposals of this tax reform, but she keeps on saying like, we don't need it. But we still think that eventually the government will be forced to implement a fiscal reform. So she has mentioned that she will not do it in the first couple of years. That's what she said. So maybe the third year, the fourth year, I mean, we still don't know. So maybe we're talking about a mix of some fiscal measures and some debt, right? So that could be the scenario.
Javier, I only have one question for you before we open it up to a conversation, because I know the Congressman is also tight on time. The rule of law in Mexico, is Mexico a more just country today than it was 6 years ago? Or can Mexicans expect a better administration of justice? Can Mexicans who are aggrieved by organized crime, by the government, by whoever, expect justice? And what does that mean in the new system, where you'll probably have a judicial system that will be co-opted by the political party and the current ruling elites? Where's justice for Mexicans?
I mean, I would say that absolutely not. Of course, the Mexican judicial system is far from being perfect, right? It has a lot of problems, but I would make a fundamental distinction, Tony, between local judiciaries and the federal judiciaries. 80% of all cases are resolved at the local level, and we have never had a major constitutional reform to give independence to local judiciaries. But at the federal level, I have to say that's one of the very few, career services that we have in Mexico that actually work. In Mexico, if you want to be, at least before the reform, if you wanted to be a federal judge, then you have to make a career, you have to make exams. There's a regulation that has given us a relatively professional federal judiciary. That is disappearing during the following 3 years. And the problem is not that we will end up with judges that are close to Morena. That's a huge problem for judicial independence. But I would say that the other part is that maybe these people will be incompetent judges. As David has said, in Mexico we don't have a bar exam. We don't have a lot of regulations for the legal profession. So basically, any person with his licenciado title, which is so easy to get. In Mexico, we have 2,000 law schools, right? Basically, if you pay and wait 2 years, then you can get your license, and then you can be a practicing lawyer with no state regulations, with no bar exam. So we can end up with a federal and local judiciary with people who have no idea of what the job is about, and that will be, following the instructions of Morena. So I would say we have a very imperfect judicial system in Mexico, but during the next years, we will end up with an even worse system, both at the federal and the local level. And of course, that's worrisome for rule of law in general. We are talking about, the people who are going to decide cases on all matters that have to do with civil law, with contracts, with family law, with, of course, criminal cases. And my sense is that the lack of certainty and the lack of predictability it's going to be a huge liability for Mexico.
Well, maybe a light. I have another question for you, and it's a complicated one, but I want a kind of a simpler answer. The National Guard, about 120,000, I think, when it's all done and said and done, is going to be under the armed forces. But you also have a Secretary of Security in Mexico, Omar Garcia Harfuch, with a force that is going to be about 12,000, I think. He's going to get assigned these, mostly the road police, the federal road police. He's going to get that. So he's going to get 12,000, and then the 120,000, 90% of the force will be under the military. What about that aspect of the administration of justice? Is Garcia Harfuch going to be, just another secretary with a desk and a driver? What is he really going to be able to do against organized crime and these huge criminal and violent challenges that Mexico faces with a small force, and most of it probably a force that is more likely to abuse human rights under the military than under civilian control?
I would say that the problem is that Omar Garcia Harfuch, and he's a professional policeman, but he's going to be the weakest Secretary of Security in Mexico. Why? Because before this reform, every single security secretary had under his control a federal police. And of course, in Mexico, the federal police was not perfect, but during past administrations, there was like a really strong push to create, a federal police that is strong, that has some capabilities with professional people working under civilian control. That no longer exists, right? So the National Guard is going to be under the protection and under the command of the Secretary of Defense. I think that Omar Garcia Harfuch, in the best case scenario, will have a lot of power in terms of intelligence, right? So if you see what the President Sheinbaum is saying, is that the Security Secretary Omar Garcia Harfuch is going to take charge of intelligence operations, but he will basically have no way to implement those strategies. He will depend completely on the military. So I would say that, in Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum was relatively successful in terms of reducing some sorts of crimes. Omar Garcia Harfuch, I think he was in general terms a good secretary when he was working at the local government. But of course, in Mexico City, when he was the Secretary of Security in Mexico, he did have a police that was under
And a
his
fairly
control.
large one.
Absolutely, and I guess, of course, there were problems, but he really tries to institutionalize and professionalize this local police. That's not happening at the federal level. That's an initiative that was proposed by President López Obrador, but to be fair, President Sheinbaum did not want to change any single part of this constitutional reform that was basically approved as it was presented by President
Our hands
López
may be
Obrador.
tied. Congressman, how are we doing on time?
We're good.
Can we take another
Yeah,
two,
of
three
course.
questions from the
Absolutely.
audience?
Tony, if I could
yes,
just
of
add
course.
very briefly to this, just to let our audience know, Omar Harfuch's strategy will be based mainly on 4 pillars. So the first pillar, he did work on that at Mexico City, which are these programs that try to address the causes of violence. So they had this program that was called Barrio Adentro in Mexico City, which I think was quite popular in terms of the results. Once again, we have to understand that Mexico City is quite different from the rest of the country. So not what works in Mexico City will work somewhere else. And then the second pillar is just, he talks about more coordination. That's it. And then he also, the third pillar is about integrating the National Guard to the Military Defense Ministry, which has already happened. And so the only thing that could make a difference is this pillar on intelligence and investigation. But once again, how much budget will he be given in order to invest in, data analysis, investigation, intelligence? We still don't know. Because once again, you go back to budget.
And then how do you operationalize it, right? How do you
Of
get
course.
it to the terrain?
Yes,
Yeah.
and also we have to say that we now have, we have a violent country in general terms, but we have specific cases now in certain states which are such a huge problem. Sinaloa, also Chihuahua, Guerrero, so they have to start acting quickly.
Yeah. This is a good taste of our annual event, the Mexico Country Outlook, which will take place on December 5th. So put in your calendars, go on our website to register for that event. Let me take 2 or 3 questions. Yes, sir.
What's happening socioeconomically and culturally at a granular level that's driving the supermajorities, the election of the supermajorities?
It's an interesting. I'm going to direct the question to you because I think there was, as far as I can tell, there was a little bit of cheating by Morena to get to that point. The gap between the popular vote they got and the incredible supermajority they claimed is just too much to be reasonable, really.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there's like a legal dimension of this issue. Morena and their allies won the election. Yeah, that's true. But in Congress, they got 54% of the vote, and they got something like 73, 74% of the Chamber of Deputies. That's kind of irregular from a constitutional perspective, because the Constitution says that no single party can get more than 300 deputies, which is 60% of the chamber. And also the Constitution says that there's like a limit of over-representation. So basically, if they got 54% of the vote, what the Constitution says is that they could only get 62% of vote share. But there were legal challenges, and there were decisions both by the INE, the electoral management body, and especially by the election court, that basically said that those limits only applied for political parties, individually considered, and not for coalitions. So there was a lot of electoral engineering using these coalitions in order, to get the final result. Again, they got 54% of the vote. That's a lot, yes, but that's a little bit more than half, right? There was like another 46% that voted for the opposition, and the opposition in the end ended up getting something like 27% of the seats on the House. So yeah, I would say that there was a lot of constitutional cheating in getting to those numbers.
Tony,
Yes.
can I
Yes,
can I
of
add
course.
to this? I'd also say, where's the United States? Like, from a foreign policy standpoint, we have been absent in our own backyard. We spend so much time in Europe. We spend so much time in the Middle East. We spend so much time in Asia. It seems like everybody wants to go somewhere else other than our own hemisphere, right? So when there are things that are occurring that maybe don't pass muster, where is the United States to sit down and demand the human rights be implemented, and in these violations that are occurring? I mean, look at Venezuela. Look what happened in Venezuela in that election. And all of a sudden, like, we just close a blind eye, we close the chapter. Oh, well, we just let it occur. Like, we are absent on the national stage. And I look, fast forward 3 weeks from now, regardless of how the presidential election turns out, it appears as if both candidates are not focused on Mexico. They're there to take blame or throw rocks, but to genuinely want to go visit. I think back, there's no reason why the DHS secretary should be visiting Mexico. It should be the vice president or the president of the United States on a regular basis. There's no reason some of these things that are occurring, and that's the way I look at it through the lens of, well, if the executive branch is going to be out, House, the Congress has to be that body that leads and spends more time in our backyard to tackle these issues on, was there cheating occurring, what occurred, and walk through some of that.
Why is our diplomacy failing? And especially with a country, I want to insist, there's no other country, all of them matter. Europe matters, China matters, India matters, everybody matters.
Sure.
But there's no country that has a direct impact, good and bad, on millions, tens of millions of Americans than Mexico. Mexico is crucial to the quality of life of every single border state, and Texas and California are not the small states. I mean, this is clearly a very important country, and yet we're sort of asleep at the switch. We don't. Our diplomacy, look at Ken Salazar's role.
You hit it right on the head. I mean, we're sending diplomats that are there to enjoy the culture and the food, and to
and the weather.
And have the wonderful pleasantry conversations, which is perfectly fine. Yes, that is one aspect of it. But we also have to have people that are sitting at the table, not in an aggressive way, in a constructive way, to go, how do we come together and we both win? How do we get to a win-win situation? Not, you're doing a wonderful job. Yes, please tell me more about the wonderful job that you're doing. And that's where we're at, and that's not where we need to be. There needs to be a different voice at the table that goes, yeah, that's great. We'll enjoy tacos after we have a conversation on how we're going to fix USMCA.
I was in a hearing not a hearing, I guess a conference at the State Department just 2-3 weeks ago, and It was about Mexico and what's coming up. Just a few days before Sheinbaum took office, the Bureau of Intelligence and Research at the State Department, and it seemed to me that there was something off, like some basic stuff they just didn't necessarily know on what exactly is going on in Mexico. So our own diplomacy, I think, is failing.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
So you brought up a valid point regarding politicians and their relationship with Mexico itself, and then the generalized public perception. You also brought up a point about diplomacy. When it comes to journalistic integrity, right? Because we know that intelligence is oftentimes interwoven with journalism and what's available to the public, albeit politicians are responsible for what they say and how they say it. When it comes to the way that it's shared with the public and it's shared through the lens of sensationalizing or sound biting, what do you think the role of journalism is going to be when it comes to empowering the nation, right? Because we have a relationship with Mexico. I mean, I've always been a proponent of a, North American camaraderie of some sort, because we focus oftentimes on the drugs or the border itself. What about the peoples? What about the greater markets that would be adversely impacted? Everything from our, food imports to tourism, etc. Every market would be adversely impacted if we didn't have a connection. But you say that the two politicians focus specifically on sensationalizing the negative aspects of Mexico. However, I don't speak directly with the politicians. I only look at the news. So when it comes to news's responsibility and journalism's responsibility, not just in terms of Mexico, but countries going forward, what can we do as a nation? Even in a symposium like this, I'm not leaving learning anything additional about Mexico. If anything, I'm learning that there is a lot of change that needs to take place and that there's nobody in a position of power.
And I would add think tanks to that, Congressman.
Yeah, I'd say, it's not just the United States, it's not just U.S. politicians beating up Mexico. I mean, López Obrador for his entire time gave a daily rant on why the gringos were the reason why everything was wrong, right? So it's this back and forth that happens. To me, it boils down to freedoms. It boils down to journalism freedom, where you have the journalists in whatever country, in this case we're talking about Mexico and the United States, have the freedom to go out and write the stories that are truthful, right? Whether it's on security, whether it's on culture, whether it's on politics, de que sea, whatever it is, that it is a free and accurate description of what is occurring in that country. And sadly, those freedoms in Mexico have only been strangled. The limitations of what can and cannot be printed has only narrowed. And to me, that is extremely dangerous, because now you're hiding the truth. Whatever the truth is, sometimes the truth isn't perfect, whatever the truth is. And once again, the United States is allowing that to happen by simply not showing up and having a seat at the table and just going look, we're not perfect. We're not here to kind of dictate the way you run things. We're just saying, hey, the path that you're on is not going to be sustainable for either of us. And once again, I look at it through the lens of, you want to get someone's attention, you use the power of the purse, right? You can say all these wonderful things. When you start erasing zeros, and you watch how fast somebody goes, wait a second here, let's talk about this.
And this is a really important question, because Mexico is the most dangerous country for journalists. Journalists are being felled in Mexico right and left. I mean, local journalists are being killed, they're being tortured, they're being disappeared, they're missing. It is more dangerous than Afghanistan or Iraq or other countries that you would expect them to be very. And then there's a perverse effect in self-censorship. I think a lot of other journalists are beginning to say, I'm just not going to say anything. So there are definitely perverse effects going on in Mexico. And this is so frustrating to us, because it obviously means that we, and certainly Washington, are not paying attention. And I think in Texas we have an extra responsibility to pay attention to that. Yes?
Yeah. I have a question for Congressman Gonzalez. You mentioned in your intervention that you are open to build solutions by national problems, but that you don't find the partners. Who you expect to be in the other side of the table, in the Mexican side? Because first, I imagine that you expect like a Mexican delegation of lawmakers, maybe some members of the Mexican cabinet. But then Tony mentioned civil society. Is the U.S. Congress is open to work with Mexican civil society, and how can they work with you?
In my eyes, the answer is all of the above. I think it's both government, it's both industry, it's academia. I mean, I visited the Tech University in Monterrey. There's so many opportunities where we can partner up, right? I think industry has a big role to play when you talk about nearshoring and you know, energy and water and some of these basic necessities you need in order to thrive. And then government, you know, and I look at it not through the lens of just going to Mexico City and sitting and having a relationship at the federal level. Oftentimes, you know, the quickest way to solve a problem is at the lowest level possible. It's, you know, I visiting with mayors of Piedras Negras and governors. I mean, just a relationship where you're going, I'm not here to with a stick to hit you over the head and say you're going to do this. I want to have a dialogue. But to your answer, it's all of the above. And I'm working very hard to highlight that I want to have that dialogue. I want to have that interaction with people that see the world through the same lens I do, people that see the world through a completely different lens than I do. But there needs to be more of that. I think there are fewer and fewer American leaders that truly want to have a dialogue and discussion and ultimately solve the problem, not just talk about the problem or worse, blame someone else for the issue.
Last question, right here.
Thank you. And this is for Javier. And I think I know the answer, but I would like to ask. Do you think that the Supreme Court could reverse the reforms that Morena is implementing, especially the judicial reform? You know, there is a discussion right now in the Supreme Court about some challenges that have been filed by the judiciary, by other political parties in different states. And how can we support the Supreme Court if they decided to reverse the reforms? Because something that it is also, I think, important is that they are going to be threatened, they are going to be probably prosecuted, and we will have a constitutional tension, a constitutional crisis.
Javier.
Oh, I would say that legally the answer is yes, but politically it's going to be very, very complicated. The court has had over the last 20 years different positions, right? So different justices have said sometimes that you could review a constitutional reform. There are justices that have said that the answer is no. To be honest, I think that this is a reform that has a lot of problems in terms of how it was approved. And also, I mean, like the content directly violates a lot of provisions from human rights treaties that are part of the Mexican Constitution. So I would say that yes, maybe the court could declare the whole reform or at least some provisions as unconstitutional. But the main challenge is it's not on the legal side, it's on the political side, right? Right now in Mexico, the federal government basically is ignoring a lot of judicial orders that have said that some parts of the reform could not be implemented, and these injunctions have been constantly violated. And I guess like we could end up in a scenario in which the court finally says that the reform or parts of the reform are unconstitutional, and the federal government, President Sheinbaum, and Congress does not comply with that order. Right.
Last section, 4 minutes, one each. What to look for? What's the highlight, Congressman?
I mean, everything's at stake. I think both our countries are on a path that we need to correct, and we need to get back on track. And the only way that happens is not just talking about the problem, which is fun and easy to do, but actually solving the problem and finding partners wherever those partners are. And it's usually not who you think it is. It's usually somewhere else. But finding those champions that truly want to get both countries on the same road again and then going all in on that, because a lot is at stake. Once again, it's all fun and games until a terrorist action happens in the United States and Mexico is to blame, and all of a sudden we're operationalizing the military and we're going in there to take out cartels.
David?
I worry very much about the 2026 review. I worry that the U.S. will not, regardless of who's president, will not withdraw, but they will demand changes that are so fundamental that it will undercut the future of the agreement. I think, again, particularly in the auto industry, it's worth keeping in mind that when Trump and his USTR, Robert Lighthizer, were initially trying to negotiate a NAFTA 2, they wanted to increase the North American content from 62.5% to 85%. It ended at 72, 75. But for the first time since the beginning of NAFTA, they wanted a 50% U.S. content, which is it's always been North American. I think that's going to come up again in 2026, maybe even if Harris is heading the negotiations. And I think if that happens, it pretty much undercuts the most significant aspect of USMCA trade, which is the auto sector.
Liliana?
I think that there's two main aspects that we need to keep monitoring. One would be democracy and the defense of democratic values. And the second one would be corruption levels. Obviously, corruption is bad in many aspects, but also for the business sector. The commitments that President Sheinbaum has made about corruption, I think that are not enough for the problem. Both in Mexico and the Latin American region, corruption levels keep increasing, and this is obviously bad for business in terms of the extortions, it decreases the profits, in terms of trust on institutions, in terms of not promoting formal economic activity, and in many ways. And I think that the measures that she is planning to implement really fall very short. So I think that let's still keep on talking about what is going on in those two aspects, which are quite relevant for the country.
Javier?
I would say that it's not time to give up in Mexico. I guess a lot of people in Mexico right now are thinking or feeling that everything is lost, and that this imperfect democracy that we have and that we constructed over the years is going to end. I truly believe we are on a regime change, but as many people during the 70s, 80s, and 90s worked to construct this democracy, I think people that believe in democracy right now in Mexico need a lot of support. The Supreme Court needs a lot of support in order to take those decisions. But I would say that in general, people that believe in democracy right now should be, just fighting, because there's a lot that we have been able to create over the past 30 years. Of course, it's not perfect, but we could lose all if we don't fight during the following years. So it's a crucial moment for Mexico.
And I think it's a crucial moment for us think tanks. We shouldn't lose our star on the horizon. I think it's important to understand that we're looking towards a better democracy, a more open society, a fair and more just Mexico, and a very strong North American partnership. And we shouldn't lose that. I know that sometimes we sound very pessimistic about what's going on, not just in Mexico, in the binational relationship, but we shouldn't lose our star. The road may be very difficult and very sinuous and up and down, and it may have very narrow spots, but I think what guides us is that idea of North America and the fact that Mexico can indeed be better. And here we are at the Baker Institute at Rice University working for that. Thank you all, and thank you to our panelists.